What is the abomination of desolation? It's one of the signs that Jesus gives in Matthew 24 and then in the two parallel passages of Mark 13 and Luke 21. And this passage of Scripture is known as the Olivet Discourse because Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives overlooking the city of Jerusalem. His disciples come to him and they ask him about the end of the age, and Jesus starts giving them signs. He says there will be wars and rumors of wars, famines and earthquakes, nation rising against nation. But he gives one particular sign, and he says, when you see this, the abomination of desolation, then you know that the great tribulation has come. And so the question today is that, what is the abomination of desolation? I think we have to do two things in order to properly understand what Jesus was referring to. Number one, we have to understand the context that led up to that discussion. What was going on for the disciples to ask about his coming, about the end of the age? What led up to the Olivet Discourse, the context in Scripture surrounding that passage. And then number two, I think we have to familiarize ourselves at least a little bit with what was prophesied in Daniel. Because Jesus, when he was speaking about the abomination of desolation, he understood it to be the fulfillment of what Daniel prophesied. So we have to understand the context of Matthew 24, and then we have to understand at least a little bit of what was going on in Daniel. So first things first, let's deal with the context. Well, I'm going to deal specifically right now with Matthew 24, of course, Mark 13, Luke 21, the parallel passages, but I want to deal specifically with Matthew 24. It's usually the one that's referenced. And prior to the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, in Matthew 23, Jesus is standing in the temple in Jerusalem, and he gives 7 woes to the scribes and the Pharisees. So he gives 7 words of judgment to the Jewish religious leaders of that day. And he tells them, and I read in verse 35, that the righteous blood from Abel, which is the first death in the first book of the Old Testament, all the way to Zechariah, which is the last righteous death in the last book in the Old Testament, all of that blood, all of that righteous blood is going to come upon, he says in verse 36, this generation. So Jesus is speaking about, warning about judgment that is about to come upon this generation. And he says in verse 38, see, your house is left to you desolate. Now, he's obviously speaking about the temple, and he says, your house, your temple, is going to be left to you desolate. Now, that's the same word, the same root word, where we get the phrase, the abomination of desolation. And it's speaking about laying waste to something, or something being abandoned, or something being left barren. Jesus said, your house, this temple, is going to be left desolate. So that's the backdrop. That sets the stage for now we get into Matthew 24, where Jesus walks out of the temple for the last time, and the disciples start looking at it. They're marveling at it, and they point it out to him. And he says in Matthew 24, verse 2, you see all these, do you not? They're looking at the temple. Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. He just said, your house is left to you desolate. He walks out of the temple. The disciples are looking at that temple, and he says, you see this, do you not? Yeah, this is going to be thrown down. He's obviously speaking about the destruction of the temple. That temple was going to be left desolate. So he just walked out of the temple. Now they leave the city of Jerusalem, and they go up to the Mount of Olives. And he sits down, and the disciples come to him privately, and they start to ask him. Mark gives the detail. He says it's Peter, James, John, and Andrew. Matthew 24 just says the disciples come to him and ask him privately, when will these things be? So Jesus just talked about judgment on that generation. He just looked at that temple and said it was going to be destroyed. The disciples come to him on the Mount of Olives, overlooking the city of Jerusalem, overlooking the temple, and they say, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Now that's really important for us to understand, because most people read this and think of this as though Jesus is specifically referring to the end of the world or the end of human history. Now, if you read the King James Version, it says, "When will these things be? What will be the sign of thy coming and the end of the world?" That's how most people understand it. But I hope you know, Jesus did not speak in King James English, and they did not record Jesus in King James English. They recorded him in Greek, and throughout the three gospel accounts, all three of them note the question about the end of the age. The Greek word is aeon, not cosmos, meaning the world, but the aeon, meaning the age that they were living in. So they were connecting Jesus referring to the destruction of the temple with the coming end of that age. Now, the reason this is so significant is because in Jewish thought, they split history really into two time frames. This age, this Old Covenant age, the time prior to the coming of the Messiah, and then the end of that, the fulfillment of that, was the coming of Messiah and his kingdom. And so the disciples were making a connection between Jesus saying this temple was going to be destroyed and the end of that age. And so we should not be surprised when the disciples start to think about and ask, when will these things be? What is the end, the fulfillment, the consummation of this age? And so that's the question that they're asking, and it is in response to that question that Jesus begins to talk about these signs. And he specifically gives the sign of the abomination of desolation in verse 15. He says, when you see the abomination of desolation, he's speaking to them, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, and he says, let the reader understand, so recall what Daniel talked about. When you see the abomination of desolation, get out of Jerusalem, get out of the city, get out of the region of Judea. Don't turn back, don't look back. Jesus is describing the time of this great tribulation, and he's telling the disciples, this is what Daniel spoke about. So in order to familiarize ourselves at least a little bit with Daniel, which is step number 2, what does Daniel speak about? There are 3 places where the book of Daniel explicitly references the abomination of desolation. The first instance is in chapter 9, in the middle of the message that the angel Gabriel gives Daniel about the 70 weeks. Now, the 70th week is also another topic that gets talked about a lot with this end time type discussion. And I'm going to deal with that whole passage in its own video really soon. So if you're interested in that, subscribe and stay tuned for that. But in the middle of this, we read in verse 26 of this 70th week, desolations, there's that word, desolations, are decreed. Verse 27, he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate. So on the wing of abominations, plural, shall come one who makes desolate. The second instance is in chapter 11, verse 31. It says, forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. The third instance is in the final chapter, and right really towards the very end of the book of Daniel, 12 verse 11. It says, from that time the regular burnt offering is taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate is set up. Now, each of these 3 passages really deserve for us to look at them in their own context with their own surrounding verses, but I do think it's clear that they're all connected. And really what I want us to notice is that all 3 of them, each time that the abominations that makes desolate is brought up, it is spoken of along with the end of temple sacrifices. In the same verse, the end of offering and sacrifice is always mentioned. I think it's plain that this is is speaking about the destruction of a temple. Now, that's something that really everybody agrees upon, but where people start to differ is on the timeline. Is this in our future, looking at it in 2025? Is this a future rebuilt temple, a third temple, or was this the temple that was standing in Jesus' day? Is this referring to the temple that Jesus stood in and gave those 7 words of judgment? Is it the temple that was standing there when Jesus pointed at it and said, this is going to be thrown down? Is it the temple that they were overlooking while he gave the Olivet Discourse? I think it's pretty plain that Jesus was obviously referring to that temple that those disciples were looking at, that those disciples were about to witness being destroyed. And really, to confirm this, I think it's helpful to look at not just Matthew, but the parallel accounts. What did Mark say? What did Luke say? And I want to look really quick at Luke, because Matthew and Mark are both Jews writing to primarily a Jewish audience. Luke is the one synoptic gospel that's a Gentile writing to a Gentile, Theophilus. And the reason this is important is because Jews would have been familiar with the language of abomination of desolation. They would have had an idea of what Daniel was referring to about the coming of the Messiah, the destruction and the ending of temple sacrifices. Gentiles wouldn't have known about Daniel. They might not have even heard about Daniel. And so Luke, he just spells it out for us. He doesn't even use the phrase or the language of the abomination of desolation. He just describes and details for us what is going to happen. And so we read in Luke 21, verse 20, which is the parallel verse to Matthew 24, 15 that we just looked at. This is Luke's rendering of it. And he records Jesus saying, "When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near." So Luke just describes for us what this is going to look like. When you see the city of Jerusalem surrounded by armies, this is that desolation. This is the abomination that brings desolation. And then when we look down at verse 32, Jesus says, "Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all has taken place." Matthew and Mark say the same thing. "Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all of these things take place." Now again, is that some future generation that Jesus was speaking about? Or was it that generation that he was looking at? Is it that generation that he was standing in Matthew 23 in the temple and he said all of the righteous blood from Abel to Zechariah is going to come upon this generation? Well, I would ask you as my listener, what happened within a generation of Jesus giving this prophecy? Right on cue, Jerusalem was surrounded by armies. The Roman armies surrounded Jerusalem. They destroyed the city. They desecrated the city. They desecrated the temple. They set up idols in the temple. And if you're familiar at all with the Old Testament, the majority of the time that abominations are spoken about, it's an idol. It's a false god. And so they literally set up abominations in the temple, and then they destroyed the temple. It was left desolate, clearly marking the end of that age. So if we're honest with the text, and we're asking the question, what is this abomination of desolation? I think it is smack you in the face obvious that Jesus was referring to what was about to happen to that generation. Judgment on that generation, the destruction of the temple in that generation, the end of sacrifices and temple system in that generation. The problem is people want this to refer to something in the future. They want this to be talking about a future generation. When people read this generation, they really think it means that generation. But Jesus stood in Matthew 23 and he said, judgment is coming on this generation. They ask him, what's the sign of the coming of the end of the age? And he gives all of these signs and he says, all of these things must take place within this generation. If we're going to take what Jesus said at face value and literally, as so many people talk about when it comes to end time prophecy, we have to take it literally. If you're going to take it literally, Jesus literally said this generation. And so in context, this generation meant the generation that witnessed the birth of the church and the destruction of the temple, the end of that age. Now, despite the clear evidence, this passage is often used to argue that there has to be another temple built. There has to be a third temple that is rebuilt for this to be fulfilled. Now, I hope that I've made the context plain and the meaning plain, but I have made a video specifically dealing with the issue of a rebuilt temple, the red heifer sacrifices, and I talk about what the New Testament authors, what the apostles, how they spoke of it, how they understood the temple of God to be going forward. So if you're interested in that, you can watch that video right here.